Best practices are an important consideration when creating or modifying existing tables. In this lesson, we will review some of the best practices for table development by each component of the table. The name of the table should contain several segments. First, the module of the table that it is associated with, and second, a logical description of the table contents. Third, the type of contents which it can include, such as trans, journal, line, table, group, parameters, or setup. And fourth, you can optionally include a postfix of TMP for temporary tables. Next, the label property is mandatory and enforced by the compiler unless the table has a visible property set to no. The text value of the label must be unique across all tables, views, and maps in all languages. Temporary tables are excluded from this system-wide validation. For tables where the form ref property is set to display a menu item, the display menu item must exist. The title field properties encompass title field 1 and title field 2. Title field 1 should be a key field for the records in the table. Title field 2 should be a descriptive field for the records in the table. The event item group table is a good example of how to use title fields. Its title field 1 property is set to item group ID, which is a key field on the table, and title field 2 is set to name, which is a descriptive field for the records in the table. If the value of title field 1 and title field 2 are the same, an error will occur. Next is the table group. The table group property is mandatory. If it is used to categorize tables by the type of data they contain, and should be set to the closest matching group for all tables. The table type property is used to determine whether the table is regular or temporary. You can use the setTMP table method to make a non-temporary table temporary rather than creating a copy of the table and changing its table type. Every table supports adding the created and modified data fields. You'll want to carefully consider if you need to track the created or modified by date and transaction ID. Only set these properties to yes if the information provided by the field is needed. Now let's look at the best practices for table fields. For table IDs and rec IDs, do not directly use the system data types rec ID or table ID. Instead, use the ref rec ID EDT for fields that refer to record IDs, and the ref table ID EDT for fields that refer to table ID. You should carefully consider your use of memo and container fields in application tables. Adding these field types to database tables will negatively impact application and database fetch times. They also inhibit array fetching, and they cannot be used in where expressions. Consider using string fields with a specific number of characters instead of memo fields. Also, when selecting from a table that contains memo or container fields you aren't using, you should use a field list to exclude these and any other fields that you aren't using. When configuring field properties, you should exercise caution when setting the mandatory allow, edit on create, allow edit, and visible properties of the field. These properties control user and developer access to fields, so you need to consider the possible side effects of constraining when a field can or should be edited or viewed. And lastly, you'll always use extended data types or enums for your table fields. By setting properties on an enum or EDT instead of directly on a table field, you are increasing reusability and decreasing potentially redundant development work. Now let's take a look at some best practices for field groups. You should use field groups for organizing related fields. It is a best practice to use field groups when designing forms to organize related fields. When additional fields are added to a field group on a table, it will dynamically update the form with new fields within the field group. You should place at least 2 fields in the auto summary field group for each table. This will automatically populate the summary view of a FAST tab in any form which references this table. The fields used for the title field 1 and title field 2 are often candidates for this field group. And lastly, if you do not put anything in the auto lookup field group, the system will revert to the fields referenced in title field 1 and title field 2, plus the contents of the first unique index. This is acceptable for some applications, but you should consider whether you need to configure the group differently as you design a table.